Hello, are we live? Can someone say something in the chat?
Don't be shy.
Don't be shy. I think we're live. We'll act like we are. So hello, yes, hello,
there
Jill.
We are. Hey,
fantastic, it worked. So thank you everyone for coming to our first session of Classroom D of the day. Today we have Daniel and Claude from the Cannonball podcast. They are here to talk about why you've never heard of the 19th century America's most popular poets. It sounds like a very interesting talk. I'm excited to see it, and I'm sure you all are too. So we're going to give them half an hour to talk, and then we'll have 10 minutes for questions. If you put your questions in the chat or with the Ask a Question feature, I'll keep track of it, and I'll ask our speakers at the end. So without further ado, I'll leave it to you. Now, how do I leave?
Been asking that for years.
Okay, good luck.
All right, thank you. Thanks everybody for showing up this morning or evening or whenever it is for you. I'm Claude, and with me is Daniel. Daniel, how you doing?
Hey, I'm doing great. This is a fine morning, evening, and afternoon and midnight, and just yeah. But this is very exciting. I'm ready to hop on in and get started.
All right, yeah. So I guess to start off with, we had an episode very recently that was kind of like a preview to all of this that was basically talking about some of the more popular 19th century American poets that were out there that you probably never heard of. And because a lot of this is public domain and can be accessed really easily if you missed the episode or are interested in this topic, I'm going to be putting a couple of links into the chat so that you can sort of read along with us. The first one that's going up is The Day Is Done by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. The second one that's going up is Death of an Infant by Lydia Huntley Sigourney. I know it looks like Sigourney, but it's pronounced Sigourney. And the other is The Slave Mother by Ellen Watkins Harper. These are all poems that are sentimental. And that means that they're trying to evoke an emotion. That's the primary aim, and then there's often a secondary aim. With Longfellow, what he's trying to articulate is that poetry for him, at least at that point in his career, should evoke an emotion to calm you after a very stressful day of trying to provide for yourself or labor. Death of an Infant is a sentimental poem of mourning about, well, a dead child. And as Daniel and I discussed, that was an extraordinarily common phenomenon in 19th century American life. So it performs this act of public and private mourning kind of at once. And then The Slave Mother is directly political. Harper was a free Black woman who was also a best-selling poet. And she used her talent, she used her voice, and she used her I guess her ability to speak to probably one of the sort of worst phenomena occurring in America at the time. Anyway, so we threw those out there, and the thing is, they're sentimental poems. They're poems that are meant to evoke an emotion, and they're extraordinarily straightforward. Like in one of the Simpsons commentaries, yeah, I'm an old white guy, so I'm going to talk about the Simpsons. But in one of the Simpsons commentaries, they talk about how they used to write the jokes in the early days. And they said basically a typical Simpson joke is there's no subtext, there's just text. You just say what the thing is, and that is the joke. That's how I like to think of 19th century American poetry, the vast majority of it. There's no subtext, there's just text. It tells you exactly what it is. Now, Daniel and I took a sort of brief trip through the first verse paragraph of The Wasteland, and I think you put this aptly. I was playing basically Stop the Buzzer with you, like every 5 seconds. Yes. Because The Wasteland, which comes in the early 20th century, right after World War I, is this poem that is densely allusive. Like you have to have your knowledge of Dante, your knowledge of antiquity or the writings of antiquity, late antiquity, early antiquity. You have to have your Bible at hand. You have to have your Wagner. You have to have your Baudelaire, your 19th century Imagist poetry. You have to have your 17th century revenge tragedies, which nobody read at the time and nobody reads now. You have to have all of this stuff readily available in order to understand not just the literal meaning of the text, but the symbolic function that's sort of like operating throughout the whole thing, right? So how did we get from these extraordinarily simple, popular poems to the wasteland and to all of the stuff that gets canonized in the 20th century as high elite, difficult art that you can't understand or that you're told you can't understand?
Right.
All right. I like to tell my students there are no hidden meanings. My students always come to me and say, well, I don't understand poetry. Back in high school, I couldn't get all the hidden meanings. Well, there aren't any hidden meanings. You've just been taught that there are. The meanings are usually right there. You just need to unpack them.
Yeah, you just have to have the requisite sort of context for whatever the poet is presenting. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, the short answer to this question of why you've probably never heard, you might have heard of Longfellow, but you've probably never heard of Sigourney and you've probably never heard of Harper. The sort of short answer, there are all kinds of social and political reasons why you haven't that have been like really, really covered. And a lot of the criticism, a lot of women's writing was denigrated, denigrated as sentimental and not worthy of study because it was so straightforward. And so, okay, let's get rid of them. African-American writing was also denigrated as sentimental or closed off, or, okay, it's about these kinds of social issues, so it's not high art or anything like that. So Harper sort of pushed to the side. And the other attitude towards the end of the 19th century, and well, all throughout the 20th century, well, I mean, growing up in the South, I saw this all the time. Daniel, I'm sure you're familiar with this. Well, the Civil War is over. I had nothing to do with slavery. It's all done with. It's back there, and racism doesn't exist anymore. Not really. Anyway, so these kinds of things get cordoned off, and there's been this move since like the mid to late 90s to sort of revive and rework some of this to figure out what all was back there. What does the full accounting of 19th century American poetry look like? And it's a lot more varied and weird and strange than what you might think. But anyway, the long story short is the reason you've probably never heard of these is because aside from the social and political things I was just sort of detailing, the mode of reading and writing poetry changed dramatically in the late part of the 19th century. And from my understanding, a lot of that has to do with the emergence of English as a college subject. It became academic. All right, so I can tell this story with two poems, or I'm going to try to tell this story with two poems. And Daniel has a beautiful, wonderful reading voice. The first poem, no, he does. He really, really does. I was blown away.
Thank you.
He was reading this stuff. The first poem that I want to take a look at is, if I can learn how to work my keyboard, is Longfellow's The Village Blacksmith. And this is one that I think is still, it's somewhat familiar today. So here's The Village Blacksmith if you want to read along. And Daniel, would you do me a huge, huge favor and read the poem for us?
Absolutely. Under a spreading chestnut tree, the village smithy stands. The smith, a mighty man is he, with large and sinewy hands, and the muscles of his brawny arms are strong as iron bands. His hair is crisp and black and long. His face is like the tan. His brow is wet with honest sweat. He earns whate'er he can, and looks the whole world in the face, for he owes not any man. Week in, week out, from morn till night, you can hear his bellows blow. You can hear him swing his heavy sledge with measured beat and slow, like the sexton ringing the village bell when the evening sun is low. And children coming home from school look in at the open door. They love to see the flaming floor and catch the burning sparks that fly like chaff from a threshing floor. He goes on Sunday to the church and sits among his boys. He hears the parson pray and preach, and hears his daughter's voice singing in the village choir, and it makes his heart rejoice. It sounds to him like her mother's voice, singing in paradise. He needs must think of her once more, how in the grave she lies, and with his hard, rough hand he wipes a tear out of his eyes. Toiling, rejoicing, sorrowing, onward through life he goes. Each morning sees some task begin, each evening sees it close. Something attempted, something done. He's earned a night's repose.
Oh, and then there's that last stanza.
I ruined the rhythm. Thanks to thee, my worthy friend, for the lesson thou hast taught. Thus at the flaming forge of life, our fortunes must be wrought. Thus on its sounding anvil shaped, each burning deed and thought. Yes, I forgot the last, the pedantic addendum.
Yeah, there
Apologies.
You go. That's okay. What is Longfellow without the pedantic addendum? He's a didactic poet. He often uses sentimental writing to tell a story, and you tack on this nice little moral lesson, and hey, you're done. Yeah, you just got an applause. No, you did a great job. Thank you so much, Daniel. What is this about?
Well, it's clearly like it's about a blacksmith and the kind of the idealized masculinity and economic mode that he encompasses. Because something that really jumped out at me when I was reading it, when you sent me the link, is where in that second to last stanza, where it mentions each morning sees some task begins, each evening sees it close, something attempted, something done. And earlier on that he owes no man. And this was in the 1830s, this was being written, and I immediately associated it with the Luddite Revolt. And that might seem a little odd because that's usually interpreted as anti-technology. But what the Luddite Revolt in Great Britain was about, this was, smashing the new power looms, the tradition, this was more about resisting the hourly wage model of economic production, as opposed to the piecework model, which is where you crafted useful items and were paid for each useful item you crafted. You didn't rent your waking life to somebody else to operate their machine. And so this is clearly like, a village smithy is of course engaging in craft, piecework, craft work. And that's exhibited in the text itself. And that was pretty fascinating because this is also the time that is going away. This is the beginning of the fluorescence of the New England Industrial Revolution, especially specifically in textiles and things like that, where that kind of mode that's being lionized here is gone. It's going away.
Yeah, that's exactly it. The poem was written Longfellow was from Portland, Maine, which at the time was a part of the Massachusetts territory. It was written in, I believe, the late 1830s, published in 1840. So by that time, industrialization had really already kicked in New England. And it's exactly what you said, this kind of idealized self-contained village life, the economic self-containing, the sort of social self-containing, all of that stuff is under erasure. So this is already a poem that's an act of nostalgia, right? Mm-hmm. All right, so let's fast forward to the 1870s, 1880s, the Reconstruction era, okay? Part of, and even a little bit later, part of what happened after the Civil War was that the U.S. industrialized wholesale, and you had the rise of certain kinds of bureaucracies. The Red Cross is one of the first major bureaucracies. Side note, Frederick Law Olmsted, who created Central Park, he designed Central Park, was the first head of the Red Cross for the U.S., and part of what he did, part of the bureaucratic job was to gather the bodies, like to find the dead. Drew Gilpin Faust, who was the president of Harvard, did a fantastic book about the rise of bureaucracy through the end of the Civil War called This Republic of Suffering. And so if anybody's interested in death in America, go check it out. Anyway, or look out the window. So anyway, to get back to it, in the later part, one of the bureaucracies that was arising was public education. That was sort of like a state thing, but you still had sharing of resources across state lines and kind of like not official bureaucracies, but unofficial bureaucracies sort of building up, right? One of the things that teachers would do to sell an idea of what America was and what America should be or could be was to use poetry. Poetry was a huge part of the schoolroom. And if anybody's interested, if you like scholarly writing, Angela Sorby did this fantastic book on the subject called The Schoolroom Poets. Longfellow and a couple of his fireside compeers became lumped together as the schoolroom poets, poets who could be memorized, poets whose works were taught, who could be enacted, and who had a sort of covert, not even necessarily to the people at the time, a sort of covert idea of what America was and what America should be, which was an early 19th century pre-industrial New England village. So we were talking about this. One of the poems my mother, who grew up in Montgomery, Alabama, grew up reading in school was Whittier's Snowbound. And it's a poem written after the Civil War, looking forward to rebuilding the nation. And the conceit is that it's this family in, I believe, Massachusetts or New Hampshire, sort of snowed in under like several feet of snow. And it's kind of apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic, but it's looking forward to digging out. How much snow do you get in Alabama?
Well, as a resident of Birmingham, every 2 to 3 years we get really walloped with a blizzard of about 2-3 inches that paralyzes the state, or at least the northern part of the state. By the time you get south enough into the Wiregrass in Montgomery, I mean, they may get a dusting of snow every 5 to 6 years. This is all to say, this is not the universal experience of Americans that it's presented as.
Absolutely. So anyway, to go back to it, that's sort of the function that a poem like Village Blacksmith has at the later part of the 19th century. It's children's poetry. And it's children's poetry to tell a nice little didactic moral about economic self-sufficiency, i.e. don't force other people to do your work for you. So anyway, no, there's a clear understanding that this is not enslavement. This is not slavery. This is not the aristocratic, leisure class and everything like that. Okay, so anyway, the thing is, the late part of the 19th century is where industrialization like kicked in wholesale, right? Everything in the nation was connected in these ways that, there was this shift from the village to the larger town or the city, and there was a lot of anxiety about the city. It was the place that was where you could find a job. It was the place that was a little bit more bustling and hustling, but it was also scary. And there's still this like strong resistance to city life, city living, or even writing anything about the city. Emma Lazarus, this is kind of like a side thing, but Emma Lazarus, who wrote the poem that's on the Statue of Liberty, which sadly was under attack a couple of years ago, that poem was under attack in her own day, and her poetry was often urban, and it was celebrations of cities, and that was felt to be threatening. All right, so there's this desire for the village life, this desire for the small town life, this aesthetic nostalgia, right? And the problem is it doesn't exist anymore. So you've got this canonization of all these old poets, these sentimental poets who are sort of like idealizing village life. And you've got these younger writers who are saying, well, that's not my experience. And yet I can't get an audience if I'm not writing about village life. So then we have someone like, I lost it. There we go. We have someone like Edwin Arlington Robinson, whose first several books are basically all about how village life is dead. This is The House on the Hill by Edwin Arlington Robinson. And Daniel, do you want to read it really, really quickly?
Sure thing. They are all gone away. The house is shut and still. There is nothing more to say. Through broken walls and gray, the wind blows bleak and shrill. They are all gone away. Nor is there one today to speak them good or ill. There is nothing more to say. Why is it then we stray around the sunken sill? They are all gone away. And our poor fancy play for them is wasted skill. There's nothing more to say. There is ruin and decay in the house on the hill. They're all gone away. There is nothing more to say.
The end. Okay. Okay.
Then that was the last stanza.
Yeah, it's a really haunting poem. And all right, the first thing I want to sort of talk about is the form. It's a villanelle, and if anybody's interested in poetic form, I heartily recommend this book, The Making of a Poem, edited by Evan Bolin and Mark Strand, both of whom were sadly passed. But it's a great book on form and how different poets have used form over time. And I'm reading directly from it. A villanelle is this French form. It was developed in France, I believe, in the late Middle Ages, but it's a poem of 19 lines. It has 5 stanzas, each of 3 lines, with the final one of 4 lines. The first line of the first stanza is repeated as the last line of the second and fourth stanzas. The third line of the first stanza is repeated as the last line of the third and fifth stanzas. These 2 refrains follow each other to become the second to last and last lines of the poem, and the rhyme scheme is ABA. All right. You can see that in the poem. And the villanelle is this weird form where it's sort of like you can't get out of it. You're stuck. You're repeating the same things again and again. There's variation and permutation, but you're kind of stuck in that situation. It's been used really, really powerfully in the 20th century as a poem of mourning, or a poem expressing mourning. How mourning, like from a Freudian point of view, is all about repetition, variation, and permutation. You lose it, you come back to it. You lose it, you come back to it, and it comes back in all these different ways. Okay, what Robinson is mourning is village life, but this is also a poem about not being able to write a poem about village life. The village is haunted, and haunting is this kind of constant repetition, right? Variation and permutation of the appearance and the reappearance, but this place is dead, and no one's coming back. This mansion on the hill that housed the generations and generations, it's gone, man. And what is there left even to say? There's nothing left to say, so you keep saying the same things over and over and over again. Well, what could be a greater description of late 19th century American verse, or the village poem by the 1880s and 1890s, then there's nothing left to say, and we're saying the whole thing over and over again. All right. So you have this situation where, Robinson needs an audience, right? And he's trying to get an audience by writing about the village, but there's no audience for city poems, right? Those are sort of scary and weird and critiqued. There's an audience for children's verse, but children's verse is already already written. Because, well, we've got all the fireside and everything like that. So where do you go? Okay, so the joke here is that in order to produce poetry that isn't popular, you don't need it to be popular. You don't need it to sell.
Yeah.
And that's where we get to academia. One of the major tenets of modernism, which is the movement that emerges sort of like in the early part of the 20th century, let's start talking around 1909, 1910, somewhere around there, is that the early modernists would make this claim that their poems are these elite objects floating in space to be encountered ahistorically, to be perfect and beautiful across time and space. Where the hell would you come up with that idea? Why does it sort of emerge right then and there? Because the modernists were the first group of poets to study poetry as a subject in higher education. There's this expectation that the poem is kind of a textbook piece to be put back into a textbook, to be read into that context. And if you're being sort of, background funded by the university, then you can have these small presses. You can have tiny print runs. You can not necessarily make your money on the publication. So part of what happened was the mode of reading changed. Instead of approaching it as something approachable, a nice little thing to buy and calm yourself with at the end of the day, you approach it as this intense intellectual tome to be really sort of pondered over and then passed on generations and generations down.
And so then you get the poets teaching to the test, basically, like writing in order to create a ponderous, dense object of study, rather than like, well, here's a nice little rhyme about how to be a good strong man who's a good dad, you know. Yeah, and that kind of popular. We were talking, you know, as we were sort of working up, you know, our program for today. You were mentioned that a lot of that energy in the sort of the popular consumption of that less ponderous kind of verse, or what we might call rhythmic language, absolutely all transferred into popular music with the emergence of the Tin Pan Alley scene.
Yeah.
And that's still with us today. Like, that was really just kind of amazing that you think about, like, what, you know, if you consider, you know, I mean, song lyrics are clearly a variety of poem. I mean, poetry has been sung since the Homeric age.
Yeah.
So that, you know, you can easily say, like, well, what are the most popular poems of the last 50 years? It's like, oh, well, it's these, you know, universally known pop songs. That's where popular poetry went. And so that, but it's not called poetry, and it's not studied as such. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a lot of the same technique, a lot of the same stuff, and I would say a lot of the pop song craftsmen, the producers who write the lyrics, who put everything together, who, you know, do that. They do have an art and a technique, and they know their art and technique, and they know. I mean, there's if you talk to a producer or study a producer, not that I have, but they know their art. And they know, okay, so this needs to go here, 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 this needs to go here. So it's just as much of a structured thing as any poem is, you know? But yeah, there are these other forces as well that begin to take the place of popular writing, and you have these other forms of expression that are easier to mass market. You can get a buck back out of them, and yeah, it just shifts. So the mode of reading shifted completely, and I think it's for poetry, it's still there. You've got popular mass songs you can hear on the radio. You've got the high-end stuff that you study in a college classroom, the high-end stuff that's produced in a college classroom. I mean, we haven't even gotten into the whole MFA thing, which is kind of like a pipeline
for another day.
Yeah. If anybody's interested in the MLA, Mark McGurl did a book called The Program Era, which is about the rise of the MFA program. He's mostly looking at fiction, but he has a really compelling thesis about the quality of or the kinds of fiction that get produced in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and into like the later part of the 20th century, all sort of being housed under certain kinds of assumptions about how fiction works that are promulgated through the program. And he looks at like the history of the MFA program and the history of the economics, but that's neither here nor there.
But yeah, just to kind of put the bow on, you know, our explanation of, you know, why I've never heard of these 19th century poets, that transition into reading poetry in that manner accompanied also the establishment of canonicity as we know it today, and as we dig into on the Cannonball on the show that we do, so that when the academic tastemakers are making their list of, well, these are good poems and these are important poems and these are poems that will help you understand what poetry has been through time, they're applying this lens that specifically obfuscates the poets who actually had the most cultural impact in their day, and we've never heard of them.
Yeah, I mean, there's a corollary, I think, to fiction. I think sometimes begrudgingly, Uncle Tom's Cabin is sort of put on the syllabus. Mm-hmm. It's one of those that you have to know historically, but it's a sentimental novel.
Yeah.
It operates in that mode, and I like I said, I think it's sometimes begrudgingly put on that list as, okay, I guess you got to know it because it you know, according to Lincoln, it sparked the Civil War. But there's more to it than that. And there's actually a lot to be said about the way sentiment functions in politics or in political writing, in aesthetics, how sentiment can sometimes be useful to get an audience. One of the things that Sigourney does is gets you, Sigourney and I think Harper, they get an audience to empathize with someone who is not them. And I think that's where sentimental writing can sometimes be powerful.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. So
I guess we're coming up on man, thank you, Claude. Like it's eye-opening, really, like to actually take a look at this. And we're coming up on question time. So I guess if let's see, I think our esteemed Lyceum host was going to be feeding the questions to us. Is that right?
Indeed, I was. I was just waiting for you to compliment me in that way.
Oh, yes.
Well, yes, we've got a couple already in. So from Jill Raymond, who was our first audience member, how do you think the internet...
Sitting at the front of the class, love it.
Yes, she's got her hand up eagerly. How do you think the internet and public access to poetry will change which poems and which poets are read in the future? That's a very interesting question. I'm interested to hear your thoughts.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'll just jump right in and just real quick that I immediately thought of as we were talking about like popular poetry and all that kind of stuff. Like I remember a flap a couple years ago. Like I didn't really read much for work, but there was a poet who I believe became popular on Tumblr, Rupi Kaur.
Instagram poetry. Yeah.
Oh, on Instagram. Okay, yeah. And I was really fascinated by that whole flap because like it was, I don't know, it was kind of the same sort of like people were criticizing for being sentimental and legible basically, and like I don't know, like maybe corny, I don't know, I don't care, but it was again that same kind of tension where it was clearly this was a very popular, she was striking a chord. I don't know, Claude, what do you think as the actual expert?
I'm not that familiar with her work. I know of it. I know of the controversy.
I just mean just as in general, like how the internet public access.
How the internet changes. All right, it's changed my classroom. Well, I have to be on guard for plagiarism, and I have to read a lot of Cliff Notes and online, bullshit. But it's also made education so much easier. I start teaching my summer courses next week, and it's all online. And I'm just posting links to everything. There's no textbook. That has eliminated a significant cost. If you have the resources, you can totally do it. I shouldn't say this as an educational professional. Please hire me. But if you have the resources, you can garner all this information. I think the internet has been kind of like a boom to the autodidact. On the other hand, autodidacticism is sometimes really sort of chaotic without certain kinds of parameters. It goes anywhere and everywhere, and sometimes you make like bizarre links that otherwise wouldn't be made.
Yeah. And I as a passionate autodidact myself, I can tell you right now that the internet is a great boon. I would not have nearly the same ability to use it to its real extent and sort of the finest quality that you can in your autodidacticism if I had not also had a university training in historiography as a history BA.
But to get back to this idea of how does the internet change poetry, I would be very curious to see, and I haven't because I'm raising two kids, but I would be very curious to see how poets are using the internet and how it's shaping form. This is why Kaur might be kind of interesting. What can Instagram allow you to do? How can it allow you to arrange certain kinds of things? How can certain of the programs or certain of the interfaces allow you to think through language and what language does and what the interface does? And I'm thinking here of someone like William Blake. Blake made his own books. I mean, he knew how to do it. He was using the internet of his day, which was the printing press. So he was basically like a guy who was a graphic designer who knew how to program computers, who also wrote apocalyptic poetry in his spare time.
Yeah.
What does that do to form? And when you read Blake, you have to read the words and the picture at the same time. It changes how you interpret. It changes how you think through the whole. So what would a visual poetry look like? That's kind of an interesting question.
Yeah. All right.
I hope that got to something that was said.
I think it did. I think it was a very very in-depth answer, and yeah, brilliant. We've got another question from someone who doesn't have a username, so I'm just going to call them Snoopy because that's what their avatar is. How much of this, what your talk has been about, how much of this can be applied to prose rather than just poetry?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Well, I think you touched on it a little bit with the how the Uncle Tom's Cabin is begrudgingly assigned a place in the canon.
All right. Poetry had a particular kind of place. It was middlebrow, and so it was produced, or it was often middlebrow, and it was also often accessible. So it was produced through certain kinds of publication, certain kinds of volume. All right, let me back up. There are three kinds of publication in the later part of the 19th century. This is when publication became really sort of mass industrialized. And you had mass market paperbacks like the cheapies, which were your temperance novels, which were often pornographic, your lurid, like detective stories or mysteries or just recountings of murders, which were just kind of like the penny dreadfuls, and all kinds of other just, hey, this is a cheapie, let's put it out there. And I'm not trying to be gross. It was cheap paper. You kept it around to wipe your butt with after you went to the outhouse. Right. So it has this double function. You buy it, you read it, you do whatever, and then you're done. You have the middlebrow ones, which are on a little bit better paper, a little bit better designed. They're around to actually be read and maybe to be handed down to a generation or two. And then you've got the big, like, honkin', coffee table books that are, nice editions that are sold to show off, right? If you're rich and you want to show your library. And oftentimes what you would do, this is really kind of fascinating from an antiquarian standpoint, you would cut it and then have it rebound to fit your library. So usually when you're buying antique books, you're not buying an individual volume. You want the whole library because they all look uniform. Anyway, there are three tiers of publishing. Poetry tended to go middlebrow to that like middle tier, but it was also everywhere. You could fill space in the local newspaper by printing a poem. Magazines, newspapers were always on the lookout for poetry because it could, easily fill that space. Prose was a little bit different because it was kind of like this three-tiered thing, and a lot of the sentimental stuff, it wasn't necessarily best-selling. The middlebrow stuff is the stuff that kind of stuck around. Little Women. That's still, considered an American classic, and much to Alcott's dismay, that was published in the middle tier. She wanted it upper tier, but it was middle tier. So a lot of the stuff that was like mass published wasn't necessarily worth it, right? Or not necessarily intended to be passed on, and not necessarily that popular because it's kind of like churning it out again and again and again and again and again and again. The middlebrow stuff and the higherbrow stuff kind of sort of lived on. And it doesn't quite have that overlooked quality. You still have this anxiety at the end of the 19th and beginning of the early 20th century about American writing being sentimental and bad. I don't think anyone would have canonized Little Women. And like I was talking about, like there's this begrudging canonization of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Twain was kind of sort of serious, but he was mostly for kids. Not if you read Twain, but that was the attitude. And then you had local color, but this was all sort of looked at as, I like to think of the local color writing of the late 19th century as sort of This American Life. Like there's always this quest for the American real. I mean, it's even part of our political parlance, real America. There's always been this anxiety about what the actual authentic America is, and beware of anyone who says they've got it. Anyway, I hope that sort of answers the question because it gets into like what was left around from these modes of publication.
Okay, and with 1 minute to go, I'm going to give you a very lengthy question, and I would ask if you could summarize your answer as quickly as possible, and then get in contact maybe with the questioner to give him a full thing. From Simon Stark, do you think there is a trend from simple rustic art forms that get taken over by elites who who then turn it into an intellectual test for the ability to understand it. And then the original drive for expression finds a new outlet. I'm thinking about this lecture in the context of classical music, ending in Schoenberg and Glass.
Mm-hmm.
So nice easy one.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Yeah. The short answer is yes. And I have a friend who, a good friend of mine, who is a brilliant romanticist, and she loves Wordsworth, she loves Coleridge, she loves the nature writing, and really gets into the aesthetics of it all. But she comes down and says basically what they did was co-opted the simplicity of this best-selling British poetry that was rural and rustic, written by lower class Brits. There was this whole movement in the later part of the 18th century of basically best-selling lower class, rustic or working class, like urban working poets. And what happens is the middle classes kind of scoop it all up and love it and see in it this kind of, oh, this is authenticity, this is true expression, this is sentiment, and then take it and make romanticism out of it by adding in a bunch of like metaphysics and transcendental stuff and if you're Coleridge, hallucinogens. I would say that like there's a very similar process. The difference is in America, there was an anxiety about American poetry being worth it. And I've actually done research in the archives. I've done archival research on how writing was taught in the late part of the 19th century in academia. And everything that everyone starts with is, well, we know we're not so great. That's the beginning of every lecture on American writing. And the reason, quote unquote, we know we're not so great is because the vast majority of the stuff that was produced was the sentimental stuff that spoke to specific sort of political or social needs often. Yeah. I would say that's a great question. I would say that the underlying answer is yes, absolutely.
Fantastic. So in which case, thank you, Claude and Daniel, for opening up today's conference with such a fantastic opener, I suppose. Brilliant. Thank you very much. And thank you to everyone who's come along. You can find Daniel and Claude on the Cannonball podcast. Where can you find it?
Go iTunes, Acast, basically anywhere podcasts are sold. I don't think we're on Spotify yet, but the Apple Podcast would be probably the easiest way to find it. Or just you can Google search the Cannonball podcast, and we have a website with like links to just the direct host at Acast. But check it if you enjoyed hearing Claude talk knowledgeably and me just kind of throw in like, oh wait, that reminds me of a thing. We have plenty of it on the show.
Okay, thank you very much, and yes, everyone enjoy the rest of the day, I suppose. Thank you again.
You'll have a great conference.
Thank you.